Technology Risk Part 10. This episode has 13 questions. For each question, take a moment to think through your own answer before I share a strong approach. Question 1. Multi-cloud networking. How would you troubleshoot an application latency issue between GCP and AWS? Here's a strong way to approach it. I would confirm scope, affected users, timing, and recent changes. Then I would trace the path across load balancers, VPC routes, VPN or interconnect, transit gateway, firewalls, DNS, and application dependencies. I would compare latency, packet loss, MTU, bandwidth, connection reuse, TLS, and logs from both sides. If needed, I would test from controlled endpoints and roll back recent route or firewall changes. Nice. Let's continue. Question 2. Multi-cloud networking. What disaster recovery and resilience considerations apply to multi-cloud connectivity? Here's a strong way to approach it. I would design redundant links, diverse regions, backup VPN paths, tested BGP failover, capacity planning, DNS failover, documented runbooks, and monitoring for link degradation. DR plans should define which applications depend on cross-cloud connectivity, what happens during provider outage, expected RTO or RPO, and whether degraded mode is acceptable. Great. Moving on. Question 3. Multi-cloud networking. How would you perform a technology risk assessment for a new multi-cloud network connection? Here's a strong way to approach it. I would review business purpose, data classification, source and destination systems, routes, DNS, authentication, encryption, firewall rules, third-party involvement, compliance requirements, logging, monitoring, ownership, failover, and rollback. I would identify risks such as route leaks, overlapping CIDRs, excessive reachability, weak inspection, and unclear support ownership, then define controls and approval conditions before go live. Alright, next question. Question 4. Risk register and heat map. What fields would you maintain in a technology risk register? How would you score likelihood or impact? And how would you convert it into a leadership heat map? Here's a strong way to approach it. A risk register should track risk ID, description, category, owner, likelihood, 1-5, impact, 1-5, inherent versus residual risk score, existing controls, mitigation plan, target date, and status. Score likelihood or impact using a consistent rubric with defined criteria per level, not gut feel. Multiply them into a risk score, and plot risks on a 5x5 heat map by likelihood x impact so leadership can see at a glance which risks sit in the red, high zone and need immediate attention versus the green zone that can be monitored. Let's keep going. Question 5. Change risk. A major architecture change introduces a new data flow, API gateway, and cloud database. What risk questions would you ask before approval? Here's a strong way to approach it. What data flows through the new path and does it include regulated or sensitive data requiring encryption or residency controls? Who has access to the new API gateway and database? And is it least privilege? What is the blast radius and rollback plan if the change fails? Has it gone through security review, off, network exposure, secrets management? And does it introduce new third-party dependencies or single points of failure that need monitoring and an owner before go live? On to the next one. Question 6. FMEA and scenario analysis. How would you use FMEA or scenario analysis to identify high-impact technology failure modes before they become incidents? Here's a strong way to approach it. Walk through each critical component or process and ask how it could fail. Failure mode. What would cause it? What the effect on the business would be, and score each on severity, occurrence likelihood, and detectability to get a risk priority number. Failure modes with the highest RPN get mitigation attention first. Complement this with scenario analysis. Tabletop exercises simulating specific failures like a regional outage or a compromised credential, to validate that the FMEA scores match how the team actually responds under pressure. Good. Here's another one. Question 7. Control validation. How would you test whether a control is actually working? For example, privileged access, deployment approval, backup restore, or vulnerability slaw closure? Here's a strong way to approach it. Don't just confirm the control is documented. Test it directly. Attempt an unauthorized privileged access request and confirm it's blocked or flagged. Verify a deployment cannot bypass the approval gate. Actually restore from a backup and validate data integrity rather than trusting that backups exist. And sample a set of vulnerability tickets to confirm they were closed within SLA with evidence, not just marked closed. Document the test method and evidence so audit can rely on it rather than retesting from scratch. Nice. Let's continue. Question 8. Scenario. Vendor breach notification. A third-party SaaS vendor discloses a data breach affecting a system your team integrates with. Walk through your first 24 hours. Here's a strong way to approach it. First, establish exactly what data and integrations are affected by pulling the vendor's notification details against your own data flow diagrams. Don't assume the vendor's scope assessment is complete. Notify internal stakeholders, security, legal, affected product owners immediately. Rotate any shared credentials or API keys with that vendor as a precaution regardless of whether they were confirmed compromised. And check your own logs for any anomalous activity on the integration points during the breach window. Document the timeline and actions taken as you go. Since regulatory notification requirements often have tight deadlines and need an evidenced response, not a reconstructed one. Great. Moving on. Question 9. Scenario. Audit finds unencrypted backups. An internal audit finds that database backups have been stored unencrypted for 8 months. How would you handle disclosure, remediation, and prevention? Here's a strong way to approach it. Assess actual exposure first. Who had access to the backup storage location during that window, and was there any evidence of unauthorized access? Since that determines whether this is a control gap or an actual data incident requiring breach notification. Remediate immediately by encrypting existing backups and enabling encryption by default on the backup pipeline going forward. And disclose the finding transparently to audit or compliance with a remediation timeline rather than downplaying the exposure window. Prevent recurrence by adding an automated policy check, e.g. organization policy or a scheduled compliance scan, that alerts on any unencrypted storage resource, so this class of gap is caught by tooling instead of an annual audit. Alright, next question. Question 10. Executive reporting. How would you present a deteriorating risk trend to senior leadership and ask for investment or policy support? Here's a strong way to approach it. Lead with business impact in plain language. What could go wrong and what it would cost. Not technical jargon. Show the trend visually over time so the deterioration is obvious. And be specific about the ask. Exact investment amount, headcount, or policy change needed and what it will fix. Close with a clear recommendation and a timeline for consequences if no action is taken, so leadership has a concrete decision to make rather than a vague warning. Let's keep going. Question 11. Decision making. Tell me about a time you had incomplete information but still had to make or recommend a risk decision. Here's a strong way to approach it. Structure this as a specific example. Describe the situation and what information was missing. Explain how you assessed the available evidence and consulted the right stakeholders to fill gaps where possible. State the decision you made or recommended and the reasoning, including what risk you consciously accepted, and close with the outcome and what you'd do differently next time. Interviewers want to see a defensible reasoning process, not a claim that you always have perfect information. On to the next one. Question 12. Audit partnership. How would you handle a disagreement with internal or external auditors about severity, evidence, or remediation feasibility? Here's a strong way to approach it. Start from a collaborative stance. Understand the auditor's framework and evidence standard, and present your counter evidence or context clearly rather than pushing back defensively. If genuine disagreement remains, escalate through the proper channel, risk committee, audit liaison with both positions documented, and be willing to accept a finding even if you disagree with severity while negotiating a realistic remediation timeline that reflects actual operational constraints. Good. Here's another one. Question 13. Leadership reflection. What does success look like for you in a technology risk lead role after 6 months? Here's a strong way to approach it. A credible answer covers a functioning risk register and heat map that leadership actually uses in decisions, measurable reduction in overdue high-severity findings, established trust and working relationships with engineering or security or product so risk is raised early rather than discovered late, and at least one automated control or reporting improvement shipped rather than only manual processes. The emphasis should be on embedding risk thinking into how teams already work, not adding a parallel bureaucracy. Nice. Let's continue. That wraps up this episode. Nice work practicing, and see you in the next one.